Hold up, because what you're about to hear doesn't even sound real at first. Imagine this. Michael B. Jordan just had one of the biggest wins of his entire career. The kind of moment that cements your name in Hollywood history. Cameras flashing, speeches going viral, everybody clapping. And somehow the spotlight didn't stay on him. Nope. It shifted. Fast. And guess where it landed? Right on Lori Harvey. But not in the way you'd expect. Because now the internet is asking one question over and over again. What did Brandy Harvey just reveal? And why is it shaking everything people thought they knew about this whole situation? Was this just a quiet family comment that got blown out of proportion? Or did Brandy really just pull the curtain back on something the public was never supposed to see? And here's where it gets messy. Because insiders are claiming this wasn't random at all. They're saying this came right after Michael's big moment. Almost like the timing was intentional, coincidence, or calculated. And if that wasn't enough, whispers are now circling that Steve Harvey and Marjorie Harvey are not happy about what's being said behind closed doors. So now you've got success, silence, family tension, and a revelation that's got everybody side-eyeing the entire Harvey household. So what really got exposed? And why does it feel like this story is only just getting started? The moment Michael B. Jordan stepped onto that stage and delivered a career-defining win, most people thought the conversation would stay exactly where it belonged, on his success, his grind, and the years it took him to reach that level. But that's not how this story played out at all, because almost instantly, the spotlight took a sharp turn and somehow found its way back to Lori Harvey. And not in a flattering way either, because what should have been a clean celebration quickly turned into a full-blown social media investigation with people digging up timelines, replaying interviews, and asking one very specific question. Why does it feel like something behind the scenes just shifted at the exact same time? Michael reached the top, and that's where things started getting uncomfortable. Because out of nowhere, Brandy Harvey stepped into the conversation in a way that nobody was expecting. And it wasn't loud. It wasn't some big public speech. It was subtle, almost too subtle. The kind of move that only makes sense after people start connecting the dots. Because according to multiple insiders who claim to be close to the situation, Brandy didn't just randomly speak. She allegedly dropped a few comments that hinted at deeper tension within the family. Tension that had been building long before Michael's win ever happened. Now here's where the timeline starts to matter. Because if you go back and really look at the relationship between Michael and Lori, this wasn't something casual that just came and went. This was a relationship that people genuinely believed was heading towards something permanent. Something serious, and more importantly, something that had the full approval of Steve Harvey himself. Which says a lot considering how vocal he's been in the past about protecting his daughter and setting standards for the men in her life. So when Michael came into the picture, it wasn't just another name on a list. It was different. The energy was different. The way he carried himself was different. And people noticed that immediately, not just fans, but industry insiders too. Which is why when everything suddenly ended, it didn't sit right with a lot of people. Because there wasn't a clear explanation that matched the level of seriousness everyone had just witnessed. And that's exactly what made the situation so easy for speculation to grow. Because when there's no clear answer, the internet fills in the blanks. And that's where all those stories started taking shape. Stories about what really went wrong. Stories about who walked away from who. And most importantly, stories about whether that decision is now being looked at differently in light of everything that's happened since. Especially now that Michael's career has hit a level that very few actors ever reach. But what really pushed things into overdrive was the idea that Brandy might have been watching all of this unfold from a completely different perspective. One that the public never got to see. Because while everyone else was focused on the relationship itself, insiders are now claiming that there were conversations happening within the family. That painted a much more complicated picture. A picture where not everyone was on the same page about how things were handled. According to one source who claims to have been present during multiple family gatherings, there had been a growing sense that Lori was always positioned at the center of attention, especially when it came to public image, brand deals, and overall visibility. And while that might not seem like a big deal on the surface, the source suggested that it created an underlying tension that never really got addressed directly. Instead, it was managed quietly, brushed off, or simply ignored, which only made it more noticeable over time. And this is where Brandy's alleged comments start to carry more weight. Because if what insiders are saying is true, then her words weren't just random observations. They were reflections of a dynamic that had been building for years. One where certain feelings were left unspoken until they couldn't be ignored anymore. At the same time, there's another layer to this that people are only just starting to talk about. And it has everything to do with how narratives get shaped in the public eye. Because after the breakup between Michael and Lori, a very specific storyline began to take hold. One that didn't exactly paint Michael in the best light. And even though nothing was ever confirmed, the lack of denial allowed those narratives to spread quickly. And once something like that takes hold online, it's almost impossible to fully undo it. And now, with Michael standing at the peak of his career, that old narrative is being revisited, questioned, and in some cases, completely flipped, with people asking whether the story that was pushed back then was ever the full truth to begin with. Meanwhile, Brandy Harvey has also been pulled into the conversation, not because she's said anything directly, but because of her position within the family and her close relationship with Lori, which has led some to believe that she may have played a role in how certain situations were handled behind the scenes, especially when it came to protecting Lori's image during and after the breakup. And while none of this has been officially confirmed, the speculation alone has been enough to keep the conversation going, especially now that people are revisiting everything with a fresh perspective. What makes this situation even more complicated is the way public opinion has shifted over time. Because when the breakup first happened, the majority of the sympathy seemed to lean in one direction. But now, with everything that's happened since, that balance has started to change. And people are looking at the same events through a completely different lens. One that raises new questions instead of reinforcing old assumptions. And right at the center of all of this is Brandy. Not because she's been the loudest voice in the room, but because the little that she has allegedly said has opened the door to a much bigger conversation. One that goes beyond just a relationship and starts to touch on family dynamics, public image, and the way stories get told and riddled depending on who's winning at the moment. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more layered, another insider claim surfaced suggesting that the timing of everything we're seeing now might not be as coincidental as it appears. Because according to that source, there had been ongoing frustrations within the family about how certain narratives were allowed to spread unchecked, especially when those narratives had the potential to impact people outside of the immediate circle. And that frustration had been building quietly for a long time before finally reaching a point where it couldn't stay contained anymore. Which brings everything back to the present moment, where Michael's win has unintentionally acted as a catalyst, bringing old conversations back to the surface and forcing people to re-examine everything they thought they understood about what really happened behind closed doors. And if what's being suggested is even partially true, then this isn't just about a past relationship anymore. It's about how that relationship was handled, how it was presented to the public, and what might have been left unsaid all this time. And that's exactly where things start to get even more intense. Because as more people begin to dig deeper into these claims and connect even more dots, the story doesn't slow down. It actually picks up speed, leading straight into a series of alleged revelations that take this entire situation to another level entirely. And that's exactly where things start to get even more intense. Because once those initial claims began circulating, the entire narrative didn't just grow. It evolved into something much bigger. something that people started treating less like gossip and more like a full-on investigation, with social media basically turning into a courtroom where everyone suddenly had receipts, sources, and their own version of what really went down behind closed doors. And right at the center of all of it was the idea that what Brandy Harvey, Allegedly, revealed was only the surface level of a much deeper situation that had been carefully managed for years. Because according to a wave of so-called insider reports, the story people thought they knew about Lori Harvey and Michael B. Jordan might not have been the full picture at all, and if anything, it may have been strategically shaped to protect certain images, while quietly shifting blame in a way that the public wouldn't question at the time. And that's where things started getting messy. Because once you introduce the idea that a narrative was controlled, people immediately start asking who benefited from it and why. One anonymous source, who claims to have connections within PR circles tied to high-profile celebrity families, suggested that the breakup wasn't just a personal decision, but also a calculated move that involved discussions about branding, long-term positioning, and public perception. And while that might sound extreme at first, it's the kind of claim that instantly grabs attention because it reframes the entire relationship as something bigger than just emotions, something that potentially involves strategy behind the scenes. The source went even further, claiming that there were internal disagreements about how far that strategy should go, especially when it came to allowing certain rumors to circulate unchecked. Rumors that painted Michael in a questionable light without any direct confirmation. And this is where the alleged frustration from within the family starts to make more sense. Because if those claims are even partially accurate, then it means there were people who weren't entirely comfortable with how things were being handled. People who may have felt that letting those narratives spread crossed a line, especially considering the long-term impact it could have on someone's reputation. That's why some observers now believe that Brandy's supposed comments weren't random at all, but rather a subtle way of pushing back against a situation that had been quietly bothering certain members of the family for a long time. At the same time, the internet did what it always does and took things even further, with users digging up old interviews, social media posts, and even body language from past appearances, trying to piece together evidence that would support this new theory. And suddenly, moments that once seemed insignificant were being reinterpreted as clues, like the way Steve Harvey spoke about relationships, or the tone of certain posts shared by Marjorie Harvey around the time of the breakup. All of it being analyzed as if it was part of a larger puzzle that people were determined to solve. But what really pushed the situation into overdrive was the introduction of alleged leaked conversations, details that began circulating online claiming that there had been private discussions about how to handle the aftermath of the breakup in a way that would maintain a specific public image. And while none of these leaks have been verified, the level of detail in some of them was enough to make people pause and wonder whether there was at least some truth buried within the noise. According to these claims, there were concerns about how Lori would be perceived if the breakup was seen as purely her decision without any justification, which allegedly led to a situation where certain narratives were allowed to gain traction without being directly confirmed or denied. And just like that, the focus shifted again, this time toward the idea of reputation management and how powerful it can be when used effectively. Because if the public believes a certain version of events, that version becomes reality regardless of what actually happened behind closed doors. And that's exactly what some critics are now suggesting may have taken place here. A carefully balanced situation where silence was used as a tool rather than a coincidence. Meanwhile, supporters of Lori have pushed back hard against these claims, arguing that the entire narrative being built now is nothing more than a reaction to Michael's success, a way for people to rewrite history simply because he's currently winning. And they make a valid point, because public opinion has a tendency to shift depending on who appears to be on top at any given moment. And right now, there's no denying that Michael's career is at an all-time high. which naturally changes how people view the past. But even with that pushback, the questions haven't gone away. If anything, they've only multiplied, especially as more and more people begin to revisit the timeline with fresh eyes, noticing patterns they may have overlooked before, like how quickly certain rumors spread after the breakup, or how consistently those rumors seemed to point in one direction, without any real pushback from those who could have clarified the situation. And then there's the financial angle, which has recently started gaining attention as well, with some reports suggesting that there were significant brand partnerships and endorsement deals tied to Lori's public image at the time. Deals that may have influenced how certain situations were handled publicly. Because in the world of celebrity branding, perception isn't just important, it's everything. And even a small shift in public opinion can have a major impact on opportunities and long-term value. One supposed insider even claimed that there were concerns about how being associated with controversy, especially unverified allegations, could affect future deals, which allegedly made it even more important to maintain a narrative that kept Lori's image as clean and controlled as possible. And if that meant allowing certain assumptions to exist without correction, then so be it. Again, none of this has been confirmed. But the consistency of these claims across multiple sources is what keeps the conversation alive. And while all of this is happening, Michael B. Jordan has remained completely silent, not addressing any of the rumors, not responding to any of the speculation, just continuing to focus on his work and letting his success speak for itself. And that silence has been interpreted in multiple ways, with some seeing it as a sign of maturity and others viewing it as strategic, a decision to stay above the noise while the narrative continues to shift in his favor, without any direct involvement from him. Which brings everything back to the present moment, because now, with his major win acting as a spotlight, all of these past events are being pulled back into focus. And the story that's emerging is far more complicated than the one people originally accepted. A story that involves not just a relationship, but a network of decisions, perceptions, and potential behind-the-scenes influences that may have shaped how everything played out in the public eye. And just when it seems like the situation couldn't possibly get any more layered, new claims have started to surface suggesting that what we're seeing now might actually lead to something even bigger. Something that goes beyond social media debates and into territory that could have real consequences for how certain figures are viewed moving forward. Because if even a fraction of these allegations about controlled narratives and internal disagreements turn out to have any basis in reality, then it raises a much bigger question about how many other stories have been shaped in similar ways, without the public ever realizing it. And that's exactly where this situation takes another sharp turn. Because as more attention gets pulled in, the pressure starts to build, and when pressure builds, things have a way of coming to the surface whether they're meant to or not. And according to the latest whispers, what could come next might shift this entire conversation in a way nobody saw coming. And that's exactly where everything reaches a point where it no longer feels like just online chatter anymore. Because as the pressure continues to build and more eyes lock onto the situation, the tone of the conversation starts to shift from speculation into something that feels a lot more serious. Almost like people are waiting for something official to drop at any moment. And that anticipation alone is what's pushing this entire narrative into overdrive. Because now it's not just about what Brandy Harvey may or may not have said. It's about what those alleged comments could trigger moving forward, especially if they continue to gain traction the way they have been. Because here's the thing. Once a story like this reaches a certain level of visibility, it starts attracting attention from places it wasn't originally intended to reach. And that's where the talk of potential fallout begins, with some insiders suggesting that if these claims about controlled narratives and internal disagreements keep circulating, it could lead to deeper scrutiny not just from the public, but from industry figures who take reputation and credibility very seriously. And in an environment where image is everything, even the suggestion of behind the scenes Manipulation can create ripple effects that extend far beyond a single situation. There's already chatter about how certain brands and partnerships might be quietly reassessing their associations, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the kind of subtle, behind-the-scenes manner that rarely makes headlines but can have long-term consequences. Because in the world of high-profile endorsements, perception isn't just important, it's currency. And any narrative that introduces doubt or controversy has the potential to impact future decisions. And while nothing has been officially confirmed, the mere existence of these conversations is enough to keep the speculation alive and growing. At the same time, there's been increasing talk about whether this situation could attract attention from legal teams, not necessarily in the form of lawsuits or public disputes, but in terms of quiet evaluations of what has been said, what has been implied, and whether any lines have been crossed in the process, especially with so many anonymous sources and alleged leaks being thrown into the mix.